Thank you. Sorry, so thank you everybody for coming here at especially you, Martin Chautari. I keep coming here, presenting different parts of your kitab different parts of your research time. So, Ruchi, Ramesi, Devinji, and I've just been meeting them over the years, and I'm really thankful to organize the book. So maybe this book is written in English, and I prepared parts of it in English, so I hope that's okay. So you book cover, I think it was Surviving the Sanctuary City, Asylum-Seeking Work in Nepali, New York. It's a Washington University, or University of Washington Press, but last year, May, I go through. So before I go into it, I just want to say a few words, like as a way of introduction to the book, what it is about, who its audiences are. They were sort of words actually. And what I hope it might achieve as a book. So, I was asked to provide a context, provide overview of the structure or content of the book. I'm a trained anthropologist. So, context, I would automatically go into ethnographic context and the research context as well. The book actually deals with both research contexts, Nepal and US. But I talk more about the US context, because Nepali political context, you all are an expert on me, so you don't have to. So, on Yedikate Gori Samay Thavan, I would like to read an ethnographic or a vignette, like examine a case of asylum. How is it as work and how people go through asylum, the whole process here in the council. We might not have time, let's see. So the book is, as I said, written with various audience in mind. As an academic book, it does engage the theoretical debates in anthropology, mostly critical asylum and refugee studies, US immigration, enforcement, border studies, and at the same time, South Asian diaspora, Asian American studies, specific debates, language and racialization, so specific chapters, I would say, touch on those major theoretical frameworks. So, second, as a documentation of the worldview, lived experiences of Nepalis and living abroad, especially Nepali migrants and asylum seekers, I'm hoping that it adds to an ongoing effort and dialogue of around migrant advocacy, activism, and organizing, legalization, which Lunaji, who works with Solidarity, she was at Adhikar, so I'll go into it from a context so that I hope it is a dialogue with many activists, not just only in the US, elsewhere as well, looking at similar issues of social justice, workers' rights, and human rights. So how is it relevant? Specific case phenomena, there are maybe some kind of conversations, and they're already happening, I know activists or something, but as academics, how can they be useful also for non-academic readership? Second, third audience, because it's about US immigration, asylum, especially immigration enforcement, I did present to United States Citizenship and Immigration Services in DC last year, or 2 years ago. Book because those are the asylum officers, like the lawyers who are in the front line dealing with asylum seekers, migrants, relevant chapters taught. They knew more about the language, and some of my informants are also lawyers and advocates, human rights advocates. And lastly, just all the Nepalis, not only Nepali migrants in the US, Nepali diaspora, Nepali elsewhere. Actually, I've left the US. Research PhD I've left the US. I've not lived in the US 10 years. Keep going back and forth, obviously. But Asia man group of Tokyo came, now I'm in Hong Kong, Malaysia I was research for that thing. So very distinct historical migration trajectories, different sort. There are also some overlaps. So Yota community, what can you not learn the novel, but what are similar challenges and what are points of divergent issues that Nepali migrants face elsewhere? They would have an insight, hopefully, provide certain chapters. So, maybe I will actually give you a ethnographic context now. lots of New York City man. Location Nepali New York is a chapter, the second chapter. But I'll just read. So please bear with me. It's ethnographic context. Once a week, every Sunday, from morning until early evening, one can observe a continuous flow of working men and women, usually in small groups, making their way from Roosevelt Avenue and 71st Street toward Woodside Avenue to the Vicar office. Tucked away in a fairly quiet residential street of a middle-income migrant neighborhood in Woodside, with an elementary school in front and a Korean church next door, this grassroots community center is not exactly conspicuous to visitors and attendees unfamiliar with non-commercial part of Queens. I don't know if you have done these there in New York, the Jackson Heights, videos and movies. So indeed, as many of my Nepali informants and participants from the language English for empowerment class and volunteers mentioned on more than one occasion, if it were not for the recently painted then recently painted on the door in bright red and Adhikar written in Nepali. I don't know if I can So maybe I'll just take a break and say that Luna Ranjiwa, she is one of the founders of this organization, and I've known Luna for a while, but this is when we actually work together. To hopefully brings back some more memories, so you'll see her in the pictures too. Popularly known as Little India, among predominantly South Asian New Yorkers and tourists alike, the commercial center of Jackson Heights, with its never-ending avenues full of colorful shop fronts displaying saris and lehengas, large hoarding boards advertising the latest Bollywood actor films and music, stores blasting the latest songs, that overpower the quiet presence of Adhikar, as well as its community members and attendees. The then newly arrived Nepali-speaking migrants, primarily from the Indian subcontinent. So, this community center offers an escape, if temporarily, from the hustling and non-stop consumer-related activities in this part of Jackson Heights. The men and women making their way discreetly to the single-story or the double-story community center are here to attend one of the several English classes facilitated twice a week by 6 to 7 male and female volunteers, including myself. So I was also a volunteer English teacher, board faculty for a few years, as a immersion. So that was one aspect of it, one context of my immersion in the community campus. So Adhikar is an important space for grassroots activism made possible by the vibrant gathering of multi-ethnic and multilingual people from the, I kind of interchangeably use Nepali, Himalaya, diaspora, So they're differently situated experiences of labor, legality, and struggle to survive in the US. So, Orko, if Adhikar stood, actually I will just give a little more, how they get involved or interested, what kind of work Adhikar did, community organizing, I don't know if you recognize somebody there. So domestic workers' rights, human rights, workers' rights Orko. This was back in 2009 or 9 or 10, I think. And then I'll say more about other work Adhikar, but sort of that's how I got into Nepali community in New York. Sometimes you can live in the same place, I'm sure, even Kathmandu, not unless you're actually fully immersed in day-to-day interaction of ours, we actually don't know larger what people are doing, the day-to-day struggles. So New York is not that different from any other cities in that sense. So if Adhikar stood at one extreme of migrant survival's gallic space for making sense of their social world and working out their suffering, the asylum's legal spaces, and state offices throughout the city, New York City, represented everything foreign and that the community center was not. Nepalis for whom I provided Nepali English interpretation. So, duita context, the dual ethnographic context. I would say I was a legal interpreter, so I actually use what I call participant interpretation. I was a participant interpreter, meaning like a participant observation to some anthropologists, sociologists, that's what I did in Adhikar. I participated, I observed, took notes, interviews. There are asylum institutional spaces, human rights agencies, private law firms. Courtroom, I was mostly participant interpreter. Courtroom, I never interpreted. It was only human rights agency, law firms. So as an interpreter, I was there, present, like cases are. So a little bit about Nepali asylum claimants or spaces, I would say. Mostly arriving to time. This we research to give you context, 2009 to 2012 something. So to time, 1 to 9-10 वर्षसम्म आएर बस्नु भएको mostly they were going through asylum legalization or awaiting decisions. They are enmeshed in different stages. So booklet you cost asylum backstage भनेर concept गरेको छु. अगाडि interview हुन अगाडि कस्तो struggles, what kind of backstage they go through. Lawyers like Hitna, the kind of resourceful fellow Nepalis, relatives, lawyers, these are all background work that actually people do because it is interrupting their work. Spending money or at the time, energy, money, sort of ultimately emotionally draining kind of energy. Limbo. So that's the part I actually dwell into. So how is it work on that? So despite you have different context from my 2-3 years, just back and forth, this you'll see asylum institutional spaces courtrooms, images despite the visible differences of these spaces, my interlocutors, Nepali speaking interlocutors, all shared a common concern for what they interpreted and I gradually learned as their social world of suffering, dukkha, a substantial and enduring consequence of surviving rather than thriving in America. So kitab then it builds outward from that. So dukkha is generic thing. Dukkha ra kagaz banaune. But I kept running into people saying, things like, every Nepali, English English audience I present Nepali, translate I put it up there. Book Nepali but it's a transliterated Nepali Washington. This is Nepali every dukha. कसैलाई सोधेर उलाई के चाहिन्छ भने कागज खर्गा छैन भने कागज भएको छैन भनेर तपाईलाई थाहा छ. So कसै पैसाको उच्च भने they don't have work भनेर थाहा छ. So over time, example, it took me 2 years to make papers. I had to work hard. We suffered a lot. The suffering, work, papers, this entangled thing that I kept hearing in all these spaces. In a way, because I didn't know, it was a good thing. Kagaz banaune ke, that was a concept. I take it as a concept. I use it as a concept in the book. Malai thana wako, as all anthropologists or the ethnographers, when you don't know, you actually ask questions. They get more responses from people. Okay, then I'll tell you. So they will have, I was young, so everybody was Didi and I. Now when I go out, it's like I'm the Didi. But these are the spaces. And then as I started interpreting these spaces, there is some kind of connection. They're interconnected. Not because they're just all Nepali-speaking migrants going there, that a legalization pathway backward work was deeply connected. And you saw then, makes it easy. You don't actually, it's like years later when you start writing and thinking about it. So what is the larger argument? Bookma se ke, then it helped me ask this question. Kasari legalization pathway, which specifically asylum-seeking, it had come to be interpreted by people on the same continuum as work, as other work taking up their time, labor, energy, so I wasn't interested just, okay, the kagaz banaune is a concept, so it's a good, cultural phenomenon, now let me run with it. That everybody knows. I'm not interested in that. What the book does is how, and more importantly, what are its uses? If kagas banane phenomenon or suffering, they're tied together and people are talking about it. So what are its uses? Social injuries, one of the social wound. Wendy Brown, she's a political scientist, she talks about the social wound, the social injuries. A colleague, a friend who has a brilliant book about policing in the US and how of the black communities and for years and generations. So that kind of social injury cost wounds. So if had been, I guess, outsider, insider, if people want to talk about it during Q&A, I can go into that. For me, it's the ethics of proximity that was more important than am I distant enough if what I was observing. And I've been living there for a long time, so I knew some of the struggles and issues, and so, but also then what are the ethics of proximity? It's actually, you'd be more surprised that you learn. You realize that you don't know so much because it's a day-to-day and you don't have to go through. So that's where I come from, and dialogical ethnography and I can do on Q&A, positionality, self-reflexivity, the questions that I can take it. So that was the main ethnographic context. So I was going through these spaces and meeting people, and so this question was research question. That's what it's trying to do. So, but just like the seemingly, going back to the classes with Zali, distinct research field sites where I locate myself, the book also engages with the dual context of migration, how Nepali out-migration coincided with the socio-political context in the US. Nepali migration to the US, I categorize, broadly categorize into three groups. Once a three-generation one, the second chapter I do it. So people arriving as postgraduate students, professionals, 50s, 60s, and the second group, families who do, family sponsorship factor, students who do, work visa. My family went as a family sponsorship, 90s, and then you have the Civil War period, 2001, the 8 someone, 9 someone. So that, I don't want to go into, you already know those are the mass migration, Nepali to the US, not only to the US, elsewhere, but these are the markers. I will also not go into the visa types. I'm sure you already know the types of visas, deadlines, paperwork, learning. So what I want to talk about as a colleague is the US immigration and asylum politics. 2009-12 was my research site, but I'm going to take you back to the 9/11 context. The 9/11 possible context, what kind of rules, laws are there, what kind of policing, surveillance, and then how migrant communities sort of came out during the protests or movement. So it's like a back and forth backlash with restricted immigration on service, but so anyway, that the pendulum, I want to take you back to the decade, what I call the post 9/11 decade. I'm sure everybody knows the US war on terror, outside so, but at the same time, the post 9/11 decade had witnessed a steady tapering of the condition of possibility for pursuing immigration as a civil law issue. So, making it difficult to disengage from the debate of logic of criminality, meaning, racialized minorities, ethnic, migrant communities, including Nepalis, and it's also a class component is important here, working class migrants. They were criminalized, police heavily, serving New York City. So sanctuary city when they were out, so Zunki sanctuary city and other cities in the US, you federal law pass communities are like the police got a fine so that they would report crimes or education needs or health care issues. So those are sanctuary cities. So that's one of the reasons why New York City, is a sanctuary city. But at the same time, I complicate that. So sanctuary city, what happens? Legalization, then undocumented and labor. How does that play out in a sanctuary city? They were not just surviving, not thriving in these sanctuary cities either. They were, so I was suffering and surviving. So, all अर्को यो war on terror चाहिँ federal immigration enforcement lobbied to enable local enforcement त्यो टाइममा local enforcement state city local court. So basically 2002 ma the US Department of Justice issued a statement saying, declaring that local police have an inherent authority to enforce all aspects of immigration law. So that was a big thing. The Immigration and Naturalization Service was under local, so the police enforce on the family. So that was immediately after 9/11 events. Internally, what I call interior immigration enforcement, these were happening. So people were more and more, well, obviously, if you don't have papers, then you're not less likely to go out. Jobs, so structurally, they've had to take their jobs under the table, the Hilir. So there were all these issues. So, अर्को institutionalization of, we take it for granted, Department of Homeland Security, there is a particular moment in time that happened, and then there's particular how did that affect government? How ICE, it's like, all of these have your acronyms, you take it for granted, but there was a time. There are other kinds of restrictive immigration policies for sure, but your agencies that's a key. So that's why I focus on your time agency, how much the effects on it, the everyday effects. It wasn't just anti-immigration sentiments, restrictive immigration laws, the policing of, as I said, undocumented migrants. In general, this heightened sense of insecurity, separating not just citizens from non-citizens, citizens of criminals. So at the same time, customs and border protection, then they started becoming directly in charge of asylum decisions. So arbitrarily, asylum decision. There's a separate history. If people are interested in the asylum institutional, El Salvador in the 80s, Salvador, sort of Central America, but refugee, how was actually asylum as a law was implemented, and what kind of suffering testimonials were generated through time. And so the asylum infrastructure, it has gone through several transformation, evolution, through time that's ad hoc. So I won't go into details about affirmative defensive stages, how it is a book. So I'll get back to Kathmandu. In practice, so this widened category of non-citizens, into types of temporalized, legally documented non-criminals. Workers were surveilled indiscriminately. Then at the same time, the arbitrary granting of asylum pathways, it seemed as a liberal government could have like a relief. And no for few. So, but that's the trick, right? And then the thousands in line. So I draw on anthropologist Nicholas did you know about the concept of deportability. Deportability is like legally people who remain, who are deportable. Deportation what about millions who do not get deported? They become deportable reserve of labor resources. I mean, that's nothing new. US has that. Japan has all quick immigration systems only with the student visa. So, and I think it's a largely research context too. But at the same time, 2006 when pro-immigrant mass mobilization so Adhikar was a big part of it. I mean, if Luna is here, we were there. And it was euphoria when all immigrants, undocumented, documented, saying, look, yes, we are illegal, but we are not criminals. So that was the first time US history time. So 2000 pro-immigrant mobilization protests in public spaces were above other things an attempt to demonstrate to the state and the American public that quote-unquote illegal aliens were not criminal aliens, but were hardworking. I mean, you hear it all the time, we contribute to the economy, US society, so this is also precursor to Obama. Right? Obama in 2008 vote. Yes, we can. It comes from a whole group of people behind. There a picture there. There you go. So this is a theory. And a book talks about deals into that attention to the immigration nation. There are key but at the same several things happened. There's another legalization, right? So criminals, haina. I didn't have the slide there, but I'll just read. That at the same time, as a public space, undocumented group, we're not criminals, then it was out in the open. And then deserving undocumented migrants and undeserving, more categories started building up. Social control, so okay, then mobilization, mass mobilization, everything happened. I mean, by the time Obama took office, the Homeland Security State was introduced in 2002. There was at the height of managing, policing, disciplining migrant workers, undocumented migrant workers. Okay, so you're not criminals, but then are you deserving of being in the path of legalization? So in some ways, every liberal immigration policy path to legalization knew that there were all these more stringent ways in which that path became more difficult. It's a kind of, I say, kind of social control. It's a bit of course, talking an hour ago. But then at the same time, asylum process, not anybody could just go online. Yeah, denied. So all these other institutions were also formed, funding the just the Human Rights Agency. So they, and the whole debate on credibility, so claims were deemed credible if they went through human rights agencies, so at the same time, in between, those civic spaces and human rights agencies proliferated. So on one hand, it's yes, you need that. So on academic, this is where I guess I differ from some of the academics working on looking at asylum and human rights. They're critical of human rights language, or the way to. So I think it's more complicated than that. If people, that's the way to survive day to day, then you have to use that language. You have to use those. Engage, because disengagement is not a possibility. That way, undocumented, so especially migrant communities and racialized ethnic communities, so if you're working with them, and then if you're getting funding, if you're getting support, long-term you have to use the language to gain. Sure, long-term and normal. So it's very tricky. That's why this topic, every step social control, how that worked. Then trapped, to me, other workers, Nepali migrants. Asylum seekers. And so this new setting, Nepali, was more private, intimate, okay, undocumented migrants are there, but instead of, let's say, harassing them, if you harass employers who hire undocumented migrants, then they're less likely to hire undocumented migrants who, let's say, restaurant owners, they're not necessarily established ones, layers, and that's all. Should I keep going here? Or I think I can stop. But that's the context, ma'am. So if I tell you everything, then you know the whole thing. But that's I'll just take a second to maybe Kiki Kosari layout chapters in. So introduction mostly I already read it. Ani, so locating Nepali New Yorkers, then I look at the distinct political moments in Nepal, US mass migration, especially New York, with the lens of the whole social world of Dukha, talking about Dukha, the concept, but that was already there all along. 3 to 4, then I actually jump into the logic of claiming credibility, testimonial construction in the asylum backstage. I actually take you through the backstage, which I who are the actors there? Because I also interviewed and talked to lawyers, and they were on equal footing. It's like, okay, great, they wanted me to interpret. Others is like, okay, you just interpret. They're like all these various, and depending on my relationships over time with the lawyers and advocates. So I got to learn a lot from both sides. I provide a specific case of testimonial co-construction, the suffering testimony, concept of dukha ta chhaदै cha Nepali communities ma, at the same time, seeking asylum, so I'm talking about the process, while seeking asylum, it actually created more injuries, more suffering. and then the irony that I sort of tease out and cute across the sort of like after people do, so let's say get asylum, that is also something green card, family belonging. So it's like they've lost a lot of time. Now we go. And then 5 or 6 months, so I circle back to Adhikar, the community center. And then, so in a way, the conclusion, paradox of visibility and censorship, saying it's an opening, really. I don't know if I will do the second part of what happens. That when people are saying, what are people now saying? What's the challenges, kids, the paradox of visibility? That's where I go back to the community and engage with my interlocutors there, activists, friends. So I think one plus, because I was already involved in Adhikar, so I also started seeing it differently, the work, and challenged me in many ways. A lot of inspiring conversations, and the book is, you meet all these people. Everybody else is sort of pseudonym, and I actually asked Runa Didi and Nobel Didi with Adhikar. They're like, yes, just, use my name. If you're using Adhikar, then use a pointed ooh. And then I think not asking names they really have on a medium, but it's very easy. And again, like I said, it's the more interested in positionality, ethnographic was company. What are the ethics of the proximity, most of the challenges. And when people say come in and out, I am part of that community. I grew up in the US, and I have seen families, continue to see families go through these not exact situation perhaps, but some ways we all channel one another. And before, I think when I was a grad student, I'd be more ambivalent. Yeah, but I'm not, I didn't live in Nepal for so long, so I don't know her. So I think that's like, no. It's like, I think it raises more interesting questions, and questions of accountability become more prominent. And I think in anthropology, if they are to take seriously people's lives and day-to-day what they go through, then you can't hide behind saying, well, this is what I do, and then I don't have any. So I think it complicates actually. Yes, people can ask me questions. So and I think so that more conversations can happen rather than I went in and I still have friends, close friends, and continue to engage. The oil has gone through a lot of transformation, but the work is still the same. So basically through the book, then I direct attention to suffering as a lived experience, the whole, but how they surfaced variously understood to articulate the unequal, what I call unequally shared terms and conditions of survival for people. So survival also becomes analytic in the book. Well, I can pass this book. I actually got this for somebody here. So, but if you just want to get through. And I think maybe quickly I should add, since Pratishtha had asked me, questions. Ethnographically, it's very easy to read, accessible, and I admit, my socialization in academic language, academia, my years and years of I was disciplined to read certain books and write particular way, theoretical frameworks, use learning, and how do you engage with what is your intervention, what is your contribution. So it is ultimately academic book probably. I do weave my ethnography through theoretical debate or something, but parts of it is difficult. Even I'm like reading, oh my god, like you're in the zone of the, it can be written more simply than this, and I take that critique very well. And next time I hope to write more fluidly, more accessible. But also comment is that even Nepali is not everyone's first language here, so you can also make that comment. Who's going to read Nepali literature? Fine, do everybody read Nepali? The high level literary Nepali, I don't know. Their grandparents didn't even speak Nepali. So, on that note, but I do hope to write more accessibly and simply. And it's much, much more difficult than with years of socialization of unlearned
धन्यवाद टीना जीलाई। अब हामी चाहिँ यो बुकमाथि एनी जोन्सनको कमेन्ट पढ्छौँ, सुन्छौँ। यो चाहिँ रेकर्डेड भिडियो। त्यसपछि चाहिँ विल गो फर Q&A। यो किताब पनि यहाँ छ। सो म यसो घुमाइदिन्छु अनि तपाईहरुले फेरि किताब चाहिँ लिनु.
Namaste and hello to everyone at Martin Chautari and to Dr. Tina Shrestha. It is a pleasure to be here virtually with all of you to discuss Dr. Tina Shrestha's brilliant and beautiful new ethnography, Surviving the Sanctuary City. I'm sure that I've already been introduced, but just in case, my name is Dr. Amy Johnson, and I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Georgia College and State University. What I'd like to do in this time is to provide some remarks based on a review that I'm writing about Surviving the Sanctuary City, which will be published in Sinhas in a forthcoming issue, and then ask one small question to Dr. Shrestha at the end of my remarks. I know that I'm not there in person to hear the back and forth and discussion about the book. I wish I could be there, but I'll be paying attention by watching the video to hear what all you pick up from the book as interesting and relevant. There's very, very much to discuss. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and start my remarks, and I'm going to open with a quote from the book. So, everyone wants to hear a good story in this country. This is a quote from Meena, an asylum grantee and former teacher from Manang, Nepal, and is made to the ethnographer Tina Shrestha as a preface to what would become the latest iteration of her asylum-seeking story. In her interview at a Nepali Queen's Cafe, spoken between the rumbling of the above-ground subway, Meena points out that when it comes to asylum in the United States, quote, no one wants to hear the truth, but everyone knows it already, end quote. Meena's words illuminate the central paradox faced by Nepali asylum claimant workers in New York City. Asylum hinges less on the veracity of the story one tells than on the struggle to tell it. A struggle that pitches claimants further into precarity and is largely suffered in silence. Tina Shrestha's Surviving the Sanctuary City, Asylum-Seeking work in Nepali, New York, is a welcome and necessary addition to the literature of the Nepali diaspora and migration studies. In part, this is because how asylum-seeking is performed, let alone experienced among Nepali migrants in America, is something of an ethnographic black box. To date, there have been several ethnographies approaching Nepali refugee and asylum-seeking claims in the U.S. through the gaze of expert witnesses or social service providers. So these are ethnographies by Carol McGranahan and Heather Hindman, respectively. Andrew Nelson, in 2022, published an ethnographic study of transnational migration journeys, viscerally depicting the environmental and social political disasters overcome by Nepali migrants determined to reach North America. Sienna Craig's ethnographic monograph, The Ends of Kinship, Connecting Himalayan Lives Between Nepal and New York, traced the ends of migration, permanent resettlement, to examine how Himalayan Nepali communities from Mustang are remade in the New York City boroughs of Brooklands and Queens, very close to the areas where Shrestha's ethnography is situated. So from these works, readers gain a critical understanding of lives recast through channels of migration and U.S. immigration policy. However, Shrestha's ethnography travels a slightly different path. It takes us behind the stage of immigration policy to open a side door into the formalized informality of marginalized labor and professionalized storytelling supporting the practice of asylum seeking. The hardships of marginalized labor become the subtext of conversation at English for Empowerment classes held at Adhikar, a non-for-profit Nepali community center located a short way from the popular Little India neighborhood in Jackson Heights, Queens. Adhikar is where Tina Shrestha has her ears opened to discourses of suffering, dukkha, in Nepali. In her role as a volunteer English for Empowerment teacher, Miss Tina interacts with Nepali labor migrants, predominantly women. While attending classes to improve their English language skills, the students regularly drift into conversations about their suffering, speaking about ways that they try to avoid confrontation or humiliation with their employers, and their sadness from being away from family in Nepal for long periods of time. Through such conversations, Shrestha begins to pick up on more nuanced registers of suffering, however, as students retrospectively describe their early years in New York, referring to it as a time of greater suffering. Importantly, the difficulties endured in these early years were not being attributed to work conditions, which is what Tina Shrestha expected. Rather, they were perceiving this time period as challenging because they were applying for asylum while working precarious jobs as domestic workers, live-in nannies, grocery store shelf stockers, and restaurant workers. Indeed, in an irony that is not lost on Shrestha's student interlocutors, many continue to work in precarious or marginalized employment even after achieving asylum or other legalized forms of migration status. It is in these dialogic encounters at Adhikar that Shrestha also learns to interpret silences as signs of suffering. Narbada Didi, a leading figure at Adhikar, explains to Shrestha, quote, "Sister, to know about Nepalis living in America, you have to first understand how Nepalis have been surviving here by selling their suffering silently." Selling suffering, Shrestha tells us, is key to survival in the sanctuary city. Asylum-seeking is presented in the ethnography as one technique in a wide repertoire of survival strategies undertaken by Nepali migrants searching for ways to legalize their status in the United States to achieve recruitment into the workforce and reunify families separated by migration. By the end of Shrestha's first period of 24 months of field work, this is in 2012, 403 out of 750 asylum applicants from Nepalis were approved. This makes Nepalis one of the top 8 nationalities to receive asylum and the only nationality to have over 50% of applications approved. However, despite the positively trending numbers, there is never a guarantee of success in an asylum claim. Behind every application is the mind-bending, physically exhausting labor of making paper, kagaz banauni. Making paper is shorthand for the protracted process of legalizing status. In the asylum-seeking context, making paper involves filing documents, sure, but it also incorporates the preparations claimants undergo to sell their suffering, including repeated interviews with lawyers and sometimes with fixers to determine credibility and to fashion a self-presentation and asylum narrative called a testimonial construction, which they can deliver to a judge deciding asylum cases. Sleepless nights are spent memorizing what lawyers instruct are vital details of claims, even as asylum seekers continue working in marginalized and informal sectors of the U.S. economy. Appointments at lawyer offices and courts often interrupt work schedules and threaten claimants with losing hard-won jobs. But they are given priority because claimants can never be sure which aspects of their case will make an impression on a judge or a prosecutor. For example, the mention of an isolated area that happens to have a tea shop in sight during one claimant's testimony completely throws his case, overturning months of diligent preparations by the claimant sharing. However, for others, the hard work of Kagas Banauni is rewarded with asylum, although it is not necessarily interpreted as the end of suffering. As Shrestha astutely observes, asylum is pursued by claimant workers, it's her term, who navigate a continuum of dukkha, she tells us, as the protracted labor of making paper for asylum is met with anxiety in the present and the anticipation of more sleepless nights' worth of paperwork in the future. For the truth, following Nina's phrasing, is that the production of a good story for asylum hinges on the formation of a subjectivity aligned with the kind of precarious worker demanded by the U.S. economy. Claimant workers, in this sense, are being disciplined through the asylum process, emerging as competent and compliant labor participants. The collective suffering of the Nepali migrant community making paper in the sanctuary city is made visible to us as a consequence of Shrestha's unique ethnographic position as a participant interpreter. As described in the introduction to the book, Shrestha's relationships to participants were mediated largely through her labor as a volunteer English language teacher and as an interpreter for asylum claimants and their legal advocates. Immersed in the act of interpreting, Shrestha's ethnographic sensibilities become sensitive to incipient meanings and loud silences in her conversation with Nepali claimant workers, migrants, and lawyers. The intersubjective production of ethnographic knowledge is fully articulated in scenes described in the asylum backstage, such as when Shrestha reveals how the rhythmic sound of lawyers scribbling on notepads while talking to their clients helped to direct the client's narration and Shrestha's interpretation, moving them back and forth towards subjects of suffering that the lawyers can imagine, visualize, and hence write down or mark in their construction of the claimant's asylum stories. The power of these interpretive scenes, such as the ones described in my remarks, prove that Sanctuary City is necessary reading really for any anthropologist or critical immigration studies scholar invested in the divergent Nepali lives unfolding in the United States. But Shrestha has aimed for her ethnography to be more than reading material for training students or in addition to an academic's full bookshelf, or in my case, the bookshelf I'm attempting to fill up with books like this one. This is a book that needs to make noise beyond scholarly circles because it challenges current U.S. immigration policy. Claimant worker Purnima, reflecting on her asylum process, tells Tina Shrestha, quote, "My life story has become a piece of amusement for people. I have become an amusement for everyone, for my own relatives and lawyers, and perhaps to you too. No? I am an amusement even to myself these days." Speaking Purnima's story out loud reveals the logics of U.S. immigration enforcement and asylum legalization. And telling Purnima's story, and those of the others in this ethnography, assures that suffering no longer has to happen in silence. Thank you again for giving me such a great opportunity to closely read this ethnography and to have the time to dwell on its pages and its arguments. I do have one small question for Dr. Shrestha, and it has to do with the participant interpreter methodology of the book. At several points in the book, and this will become apparent to anyone who picks it up, you'll notice that there's lots and lots of dialogue and reported speech in English and then also translated for us into Nepali. And as I was going through the introduction and some of the endnotes, I was looking for a description about the decisions around the quotes. And whether or if the quotes were direct speech transcribed from interviews, or whether they were represented speech, reconstructed from memory or from field notes or other kinds of jottings. And this has to do with sort of kitab banoni, or how does one write a book. And there's a slight difference, of course, between verbatim transcribed dialogue and reconstructed dialogue. And so much of this book is narrated in the words of the different asylum claimants and other migrants. And so I was just curious about the veracity of some of that dialogue, if it was reported speech, if it was recorded speech, or if it was reconstructed speech, and the differences and nuances between those in the text. So I appreciate the opportunity again to give my thoughts and remarks on this excellent book, and I will go ahead and silence myself so that you all can go ahead and enjoy the discussion. Thank you again so much, and Dr. Shrestha, I look forward to meeting you in the future.